Welcome back to everyone here in McLean and to all of those of you who are watching online. So yesterday, Ed Amoroso moderated a panel of vendors who've incorporated the ATT&CK framework into their products and services in some way. And today we're going to get a slightly different perspective, that of end user organizations that are incorporating ATT&CK into their enterprises. I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague, Katie Nichols, who will be the moderator for this panel. Katie is a lead cybersecurity engineer here at MITRE with extensive experience in security operation centers, and she is a member of the core ATT&CK team, where she focuses on cyber threat intelligence applications of ATT&CK. With more than a dozen publications to her name, Katie has shared her expertise with presentations at B-Sides Las Vegas, the SANS Threat Hunting Summit, and the FireEye Cyber Defense Summit. She was the 2018 recipient of the President's Award from the Women's Society of Cyber Jitsu, and she's also a program manager for the Cyber Jitsu Girls Academy, a program designed to inspire exploration in the fields of technology, cybersecurity, and electronics. Please welcome Katie Nichols.
Thank you so much, Rich, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for sticking around this afternoon. Really excited to be here for a panel today. As myself and the team, we go out, we talk to so many of you in different organizations. The question we often get is, how are other organizations using ATT&CK, right? What are others doing that I can learn from? So that's kind of the question that inspired this panel. So I'm really pleased to be joined by my three panelists, Dan Bernholtz from JPMorgan Chase, John Bagg from Booz Allen Hamilton, and Dave Westgard from Target. Unfortunately, John Hubbard got stuck with jury duty. So that's a pretty good excuse not to be here, but we wish him well. So Rich gave me a kind introduction. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. So if you can just tell us who you are and why you're here, right? Introduce your organization and how you're using ATT&CK. So we'll start here with Dan.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Katie. My name is Dan Bernholtz. As mentioned, I work for JPMorgan Chase, where I've been for, I guess, about 7.5 years now, and really focus on doing work around exactly what we've been talking about over the past couple of days. So how can we model threat activity? How do we model adversary activity? Look at our defensive posture related to those models and help prioritize kind of the defensive enhancements to help mitigate. So
great. Thanks for being here. Move down to John.
Yeah. Is that working? All right. John Bagg, Booz Allen. So real quick, I want to talk about maybe 2 ways that we're using ATT&CK in our organization, both internally and our consulting business. The first, and to kind of take a step back, and I'll realize that this problem that we're trying to solve is huge. Cybersecurity is not an easy thing, and I think everybody in this room, we're all in the fight, we're all in the trenches doing the good work, but our colleagues and our management, the enormity of the problem can be somewhat debilitating. You get all this outside noise, and you don't really know what works and what doesn't work, and it causes people to put their head in the sand and kind of just keep the status quo. But I think that's the opportunity that we have and everybody here has to break into the boardroom and say, ladies and gentlemen, don't listen to all of them. I have the playbook, the attacker playbook, and you bring out MITRE ATT&CK and you put it on the table and say, this is the game board. This is the space we're operating in. These are all the things that the adversaries are going to do. And we know this. And now let's pivot over and look at our environment. This is our environment. And this section of tactics, this is the space in our environment where we're going to be successful detecting and preventing. And these other tactics over here, we're going to be successful detecting and preventing in this area of our environment. And you pause and you look at the board, and what you've done is you've created the strategy for how you're going to invest in your capability moving forward. An interesting thing happens. The collective blood pressure of the room probably drops about 10 points. And the other thing, and if you've known me for any period of time, you know that I love to get on my soapbox about this. So I'm going to digress for another 2 seconds.
Go for it. I'll allow it.
As an industry, we have to get away from this perspective of one event equals one alert. And I think we all know, and ATT&CK and the ATT&CK community has really shown us that our ability to detect malicious, suspicious activity far exceeds anybody's ability to triage, verify, and respond. And so what we're doing is somewhat counterproductive. We're taking frameworks like ATT&CK and implementing that into detection logic, but then turning the screws on all that logic so that we drive down this false positive to control the volume of alerts we see. But in effect, what we do is drive up false negatives, which kind of takes the teeth out of the investment that we've just made. But I think there's opportunity in that. There's the opportunity to take those events for really what they are. It's the cyber tip hotline. It's potential evidence that something fishy is going on. And if we treat those events like that, then we can say, well, let's use the preponderance of evidence to focus our investigation activity on the objects, the entities in our environment that are most suspicious to us, right? And when we focus on those entities, we break this paradigm of focusing on the individual actions and trying to solve the problem of the action. And we focus on kind of the whole patient to bring it into medical terms and not just the symptoms. And we net a better result.
Yeah, I think you make great points, John. And I think it's throwing back to a lot of the presentations today, right? Talking about when Kyle was talking about false positives. Ellie yesterday talking about briefing executives. You talked about that. So a lot of similarities I'm catching across this conference. So thank you so much. We'll move on to Dave.
Hello, everybody. I joined Target about 2.5 years ago. I'm a member of the Threat Intelligence and Detection Engineering team. My main focus is to build detection that is good for outlining where any intruders might pop through. We build attack around. Pardon me.
No, you're good. I know a lot of the teams at Target use ATT&CK, right? I think that's what, when I was talking to you and David Bianco and others there, that was what was so cool to me, is that, we talk about so much about ATT&CK being a common language, and you're really doing that at Target, right?
Yeah, I had the privilege of working with Dave, and one of the things that we used to start off with for attack was a discussion of the SANS Find Evil poster. And we started taking that poster and turning into tabular data. And as we started going through that data, I was finding that things were mapping to MITRE ATT&CK framework items. And we were able to use that as a starting point for discussions, grabbing other open source intelligence and adding that to this data collection, and then turning that into a series of hunts, and turning those hunts into detection and prevention.
Yeah, I love the Find Evil poster. I've had it up in many SOCs that I've worked on. I'm sure others do as well. So great. Thank you all for kind of introducing yourselves and how your orgs are using attack. So I talked about the purpose of the panel. Let's dive into that. So tell us a little bit about some best practices, lessons learned as you've been using attack, and also what's helped you most with bringing attack into your organization. So I think let's start in the middle with John.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. So I think one of the big problems that we see at the onset is you bring in a framework like attack kind of late in the game. You say, this is our capability and we want to add attack to it. But you've already made investments in data visibility and access. And so what we find a lot of times is that the capability you have is really kind of at the far right of the framework, because you spent a lot investing in the network type visibility and capability, because you can get, broad swaths of visibility, right out of the gate across, many different endpoints, users. But the meat of the framework really lives on the endpoint. And so in that, when you bring attack into the conversation, it's really got to be at the requirement stage, that these are the things that we want to be able to do, and then go focus on what are the things that we need to invest in, the technology, the visibility, the capability that's going to enable us to be successful in the areas of attack that we're most concerned about.
So a follow-up to that, so you have people, you'd ideally like them to start with requirements, and I agree. I always say that for threat intel, right? But if they are beyond that, do you have them go back to square one? And is that a tough message to deliver sometimes, or how do you handle that if people feel like they're beyond just developing requirements?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it a lot in terms of assuming the technical debt of past IT and security investments. There's definitely not a rip and replace. There's definitely a lot of goodness. And actually using something, we're using attack to figure out where your visibility is right now is a super powerful motivator for future investments as well. So not to say, let's get rid of everything that we have, but in the reality of the situation, we're really great at detecting, what's coming into our boundary and what's leaving our boundary. Our next set of investments really have to focus on this middle tier of what's going on at our endpoints.
Yep. Great point. Yeah, as a team, we always talk about one of the use cases for attack being kind of security engineering. Like, we have limited resources in SOCs, right? So how do we prioritize what tools we buy? So similar point to what you made. Move over to Dan. Best practices, lessons learned, what would help others?
Yeah, so I guess when we found attack, when we kind of stumbled on attack and the leaps that attack had made over the last year or two to include Linux and mobile and Mac and pre-attack as well, and it really became a feasible, viable option to use as a taxonomy for TTPs. There's so many possibilities for it, right? There's the intelligence, there's mapping to detections, there's mapping to protections, there's the endpoint and incident response, there's for emulating red team, all the kind of stuff that people have been talking about over the last 2 days. And it was a bit overwhelming as far as kind of where do we start? And so it's a simple takeaway, but as people are making notes and what are they going to do when they get back to their organizations tomorrow? One thing I would say is kind of keep it simple and figure out, one, where does it make the most sense? And if you're not even sure what to do there, what do you have control over? So is it, you're part of a threat intelligence team and you're trying to find ways to aggregate adversary activity and find trends. Start there and start to show kind of a proof of value of attack. And then as the other teams see what you're doing, And as you kind of share that information out, you already have it implemented, and you have people that can answer questions when there's frustrations or misunderstandings or just excitement, and you have kind of resources available already internally that will help drive further adoption of attack. So I guess I would say, start small, find places where you can control and start to show that value of the attack, and then build from there. If you're like some of the organizations that are presented today, it's exciting to see how far this community's come over the past year. But I guess that would be my main kind of lesson learned takeaway.
That's a great one. Keep it simple, stupid, right? I always go back to do what you can with what you have where you are, right? Yeah. We're not going to be able to run before we walk. So
yeah, that and sorry, that and don't let it's like that expression, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be some techniques you have questions about, but as Alex mentioned yesterday, it's leaps and bounds ahead of where we were before. So yeah.
Kyle said it's a continuous process, right? It's a galaxy. It's not don't stop at green. It's a galaxy. So heading down to Dave.
Dan, I like what you said about starting simple. It's really important to just start picking at threads there. And as soon as the minute that you find a detection of any sort, that can also lead to more tactics that are revealed, malware that can be reverse engineered, and that data can be put back in the cycle. One of the best practices that we have with that we use attack for is communication. I was chatting with Katie before this, and I said, attack for me is a place where the science of detection meets the art of communication. So, and the communication isn't just between teams; it's between our teams and our management and our external intel partners.
I love that. And I was chatting with Ellie after her talk. So much of our challenge in this field is communicating our ideas, our thoughts to leadership, to others. And if you can do that, you'll have a lot more success. And I think if attack can help with that, that's awesome. Help with that communication. Excellent.
If you don't mind, just one more comment on that too, is as you grow the adoption of attack in your organization, you're going to be able to do different things. And so an example is if you implement attack in your intelligence team, and you can start to look at trends and patterns with adversaries. If you then implement attack for your SIM and your CERT or SOC or whatever you call it in your organization, then you can look at trends and patterns there. Then you can kind of move to the next step, which is, well, how come I'm seeing this technique used a lot in the wild with the adversaries that I've determined to be important to my organization, but I'm not seeing it here? Is that because we don't have the right detections? Is that because these are the wrong adversaries to be tracking, and vice versa? Why are we seeing something a lot here, but when we look at the intelligence, it doesn't look like the adversaries we're tracking use that a lot? And kind of as you drive adoption, you can use that data and kind of help to normalize and also get a fuller picture of the landscape.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something else from threat intel background, the absence of data, that's intelligence too, but people don't often think about that. So I really appreciate that point, Dan. All right, so you're all very kind, agreeable people, but we know attack has issues. We had an awesome discussion earlier today about some of the challenges. So lay it on us. What has been the most challenging part about implementing attack? What are some of your issues with it? And I'm going to go to you first, Dan, because we've had discussions about this where you've given us really constructive feedback. So how can it be better? What are the issues with it?
So first of all, I think attack is great. Let me preface it with that. It's something that we've been kind of looking for in the industry for a long time. So with that preface, I'll say, I think there is still room for attack to grow, and there's a couple key areas that really stand out to me. One is I've heard the term refactoring or normalizing the granularity in techniques. And, a lot of people have talked about, well, there's even something below techniques, whether you call that procedures, you call that technique usages, methods, whatever it may be. I think attack's kind of at a crossroads on, do we want to continue to build the framework down? And will it become overly complex and unwieldy? Because, the beauty of attack is it's very intuitive. It's simple. You look at it, you understand it. And then on the other hand, if we don't, how do we kind of normalize the difference between some of these very specific execution techniques with things like trusted third parties? Yeah, I think that's one area. The other area is, if you think about the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability, attack has exfiltration, so they have the C covered. I think there's still opportunity for the integrity and availability piece, whether that's new tactics like disruption and manipulation, whether that's, whatever kind of path the community decides to take and an attack as a team decides to take. I think there's a lot of room to build those things out. And so, for example, in financial institutions, when we're looking at attackers that maybe manipulate transactions or things like that, what is the kind of integrity type issues? The other thing is, I think availability is a gap, because you speak to some people in other teams and maybe they're not as familiar with attacker tactics and techniques. First thing they ask is, where's DDoS? And so, without that, then they kind of start to lose buy-in. So I think integrity and availability, I think there's some room there. So kind of normalizing granularity in those two pieces.
Totally agree on both of those. They are working on, we talked about sub-techniques, trying to get to some more, granular level of detail for those who want that use case. And then on the IA, the integrity and availability, we're also struggling with that question right now, is what do data destruction, data manipulation, things like that, how does that fit in? It's a gap. And I look all kinds of threat reporting and there's ransomware and I'm like, well, it doesn't quite fit, right? Some of the lateral movement execution stuff, but those integrity availability. So point well taken. And I think you just volunteered to kind of help us map that out. So thanks so much for your help, Dan.
You're welcome.
Let's head to John.
So again, I like attack. I think it's great. I think just by the energy and excitement over these past few days, you can see how powerful and transformative it's been. To take that, as overall attack is great. But in terms of what could be improved or what challenges we're seeing, I think the biggest one is kind of in communication. So sometimes we're seeing, or a lot of times we're seeing, a difference between perceived detection capability and actual detection capability. And we know that degrades over time, or that gap gets wider. But when you use like the two-dimensional attack framework as a representation of your capability, and kind of just to go with what you were saying a second ago, like how deep do you go in that granularity? What's too deep? Well, when there's multiple layers below each box on the framework, it's easy for somebody who doesn't fully understand that complexity to say, hey, I'm covered for this technique, so I don't need to invest in this space anymore, because it's got a check mark, it's got a detection in there or a control associated with it. And it can be dangerous in the long term, because you could perceive that you have better capability than you actually have. Now, in that, I don't necessarily have a solution for you other than following that down the rabbit hole to the nth degree. But I think that's been the toughest thing in terms of trying to message what attack can be and how to message up the successes you're having around it.
It's a great point, and it's something that we discussed amongst our team. And Kyle talked about it earlier. What does green look like? And there's a challenge. The stoplight chart with the red, yellow, green. It's great for communicating to execs, but then do you paint yourself in a corner because they want to know, well, green, why are you still working on that detection? That's not. Green doesn't mean done. It means maybe high confidence. So in reality, it's more yellow and red, right? So I think that's a huge challenge a lot of organizations are facing about how do you define high confidence? What is green? So I appreciate that point. Heading down the line to Dave.
So we see that for people that are coming into attack from an intel perspective, when they identify groups that they want to track, it's very easy to migrate your way through attack and find out what tactics they're using. But for people that I follow, like Nick Carr and Sub-T, these guys come up with these fantastic methods for detecting processes that flow or things that the endpoint is doing. In the process of me taking that data and saying, okay, well, how do I detect against that? What I'll do is sit down and start testing and start trying to see if it'll scale up. Well, part of my design process for my rules is to build descriptive names and add meta tags. We'll decorate the T number at the end of these, like so many of these other presenters have mentioned. What the problem is I come up with a new technique like for NLTest.exe is can squarely align under, there's two, it can look for credentials on a host, or you can look for what domain control, so you can use it to scan for remote resources. There's a time and place where that kind of an example doesn't fit neatly under one or two. So when I've always said I've kind of used attack backwards, and when I try to map stuff back, it doesn't always align. Now they've provided a great method for me to provide feedback for them, but we'll see how some of that information turns up.
Yeah, so what do you do in that type of situation, right? If it doesn't map to a specific technique, do you tag multiple techniques? Do you just note it's not a technique, or?
We'll give best effort. I think the most important thing with the way that I do my rule name construction and my decoration from original vendor logs is that when it fires the glass, it knows the incident responder knows the story. So in the process of laying a wide net of detection based on attack criteria, what I try to do is try to make that minefield light up like a Christmas tree when it actually transpires, and then my incident responders can look at that and I can help them along the way of telling the story of what actually happened.
Gotcha. Good. So we've talked about it a little bit so far, but I'll open it up to whoever wants to jump in on additional changes you'd like to see. You know, you mentioned integrity and availability, Dan. Is there anything else you'd like to see from attack in the future direction? So I'll open it up to anyone who wants to answer. Go to the middle with John.
Yeah, one of the things that that you all have been a little bit hesitant to do, which I understand, is kind of take the next step in terms of identifying like relative priority of tactics and techniques. I think in an initial adoption of attack, everybody always asks, like, where do I start? And I think that, you know, what's come very apparent over the past 2 days here is everybody's starting with similar, same problem set and kind of moving in their own direction. I think that there's incredible opportunity to kind of collect those successes and failures potentially, and put together a initial set of, you know, this is initial priority or what you should do first or something like that, and have that curated. I mean, it's being done in the attack community, but it's absent from the framework. And I think that that's, you know, a huge gap in terms of extending adoption past the people who, you know, are proactively, you know, out in the market trying to solution that, like, lower cut of people who are looking to be engaged need something like that.
So what would you envision that would look like? Would you like to see, like, here are the priority techniques or chains of techniques, or if you're getting started, look at this or this? What would that look like to you?
Well, I think you know, some of the techniques are super common, and some are maybe a little bit more obscure. So maybe some statistics or some representation of what you're most likely to encounter to provide some element of initial focus. So if we know that, for instance, that great presentation yesterday that showed the decision treeing of
yeah, from Emily. That was
yeah,
awesome.
from Emily. It was really great. And if you know, your eyesight's pretty good, you could read. There was across a lot of those branches in the tree, very similar boxes that started to appear. That type of information is incredibly useful to somebody who's looking at, you know, hundreds of boxes here. Which one's the most important? Well, if I knew, you know, 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, somebody has to move laterally, maybe I would focus on that because maybe I do have that visibility and that capability. And that's the type of information I need to know going forward, that, you know, this is a priority area for me to focus on.
Got it. I made a note. You know, one of the challenges, and if we moved in that direction, we'd love to see more data from the community to help us with that, right? Because we're limited. Our team goes through open source reporting, which has a lot of information. And I think from that, we're pretty sure command line interface and PowerShell are pretty freaking common, right? But do we know that that's representative of all data about all intrusions? Not really. So we could do that type of, you know, counting of the most common techniques based on open source reporting that we've mapped, but realizing that's a biased data set. So I agree that type of thing would be so useful. And, you know, if we went in that direction, I guess I'd look to the rest of the community to share data with us. You know, if there's, you know, that open source data is biased, or hey, this technique, you have very few uses of it in your site, but I know that's being used more commonly in the intrusions I see, that'd be great feedback to get. But I appreciate the note, and I've taken a note, you know, getting started, how do we start? What techniques do we focus on? Another thing Blake likes to talk about is bottleneck techniques, right? And so maybe we could do something around that. Like once adversaries get in, they're probably gonna have to do some kind of discovery before they move laterally, right? Or a lot of them are gonna dump credentials. So what are those things they're gonna do early on? Kind of mapping like a kill chain lifecycle thing with attack, combining frameworks, mind blown. But that's something else to look at there. So I appreciate the feedback, and we'll see what we can do. Heading down, either Dan or Dave, any comments on future, what you'd like to see?
One of the things that that I'd like to see is, pardon me, I can't talk right now.
Got some water underneath there. Do you want to jump in, Dan?
I'll jump in. So
Dave has a drink.
It's been touched on quite a bit, and I don't think the answer is immediately clear, and which is fine. But it's how do we now encapsulate the data that's collected by using attack and help that to make these risk decisions. So, you know, sometimes I think about the difference between understanding your defensive posture and where your defenses are lacking, and also quantifying risk. You know, so if you look at frameworks like NIST or some of these others, when you look at the level of abstraction with a lot of risk frameworks, and then you look at attack, you know, ideally you're going to be collecting information that makes objective data that helps you make these risk decisions. How do we now take this, wrap it either with a risk framework or find some mapping, and be able to kind of maintain these things so that we can say, okay, the operations teams are collecting a bunch of data. This is what the findings are. This is what we're seeing. And now this is related to kind of the larger picture when we look at broader risk frameworks. Where is that connective tissue?
Great point. We'll head back down to Dave.
Some of the things that we've talked about in the past are the resistance for MITRE to go too far in their descriptions, and the stated position that you're going to rely on the user to do the extension. What I'd like to see in the future is perhaps develop some curriculum where MITRE can say is, look, this is really how far we're going to go on this topic, and we're not going to go here. The interpretation is up to you. So it's an elimination of that fuzzy line rather than just be put back. And I think that'd be something that would make a great opportunity for like a SANS course or something like that.
Interesting. Taking the note. Yeah, we've aligned some of kind of our philosophies and tried to explain those in a philosophy paper, but kind of going one step further, like what do we do? What do we not do? So certainly appreciate that. Well, as we start to close up the panel, and we'll open up to Q&A, but wanted to give you a chance. What else haven't we talked about? You know, if there are organizations who are just starting with attack, especially, What have we missed? What else do you think it's important for them to know? And we'll start with Dan and just go down the line.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I think something that's been interesting by looking at the defensive mappings or the control mappings to techniques, some of them map very cleanly to detective controls. Some of them map cleanly to protect controls. So one of the things that I think is almost a better path to take is, instead of relying so heavily on just a type of control, whether that be detect, protect, system hardening, et cetera, you can kind of build a narrative around these different techniques and say, for these, we really focus on protect controls, or for these, we really focus on system hardening. For these, it's more of a detection strategy to identify, and not really look at it as each type of control needs to completely fill in the entire framework. And so I think that's something that's worthwhile to take a look at in your organizations.
John.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it kind of leads into my thought as well. When you start out with attack, it can be, you can be all energized and you say, I'm going to do all of this, right? I'm just going to check off every box here. It's not really possible or feasible. And, at least my understanding, and you all might disagree with me, it's not really the intention of attack to say you must be able to prevent, detect, control all of these things. It's more of just a knowledge tool to say this is all everything that could happen. So in that, especially when you're starting out, focusing on areas that you feel are priority, that you feel given your environment are most susceptible, and then making that determination of what can I prevent and what can I control and what can I only detect on, and having that strategy out of the gate, but with the realization that 6 months from now you're not going to be green across the board, and making sure you're setting expectations appropriately. Great point.
Heading on to Dave.
Yeah, I think I was talking to a gentleman from Aviva earlier, and I was saying, hey, where would you start if you were just starting out today? And some people wish to go as far left in the try and start trapping stuff as it's coming in. But if they're already in and they're trying to sneak stuff out, it makes a good sense to build detection around exfiltration. But the common thread that we came up with in that conversation was that it's important to start somewhere and work from there. Just keep pulling that thread. When you find something, take an intense look at it, and figure out, try to go down the attribution route if that's possible. Try to examine what this thing does, and if there's versions of it that have been viewed seen in the past, and just to try and build out that picture. And so it can be approached very organically from a simple, humble start. I think it's important to note that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I should mention that one of the challenges as we talk about prioritizing where we start, we don't want attack to be too prescriptive, right? Because we realize every organization is different. So I guess we look to the community, right, to give each other ideas. But if there's a way we can help folks get started more easily, I think we can certainly look at that. So in our remaining time, I wanted to open it up to audience questions and answers. Please, we have a throw mic. We got the mics in the center. So any questions for our panelists? As people are thinking about it, one I have for John, because as Booz Allen, you probably walk into a lot of SOCs. I was wondering if there's common misconceptions you've heard. If people walk in and they say, I want attack, misconceptions about what it is or how it can be used that you've heard.
Yeah, I think it it comes down to the point from just a second ago that we walk in and somebody's like, hey, I found this great thing called attack. Have you seen it? Like, yeah, we think it's great too. And they're like, I want this, right? I want all of this. Go do that, right? And
do attack.
Do attack. Because it makes sense. These are all the things that they can do. So we'll just stop it all. And again, it's not that easy. And just understanding the problem space doesn't really remove the requirement, to do the hard work to get there. And I think that the energy goes down a little bit when you say that.
It's hard work. No one likes to hear that, right?
Yeah.
You want an easy button.
there's certainly no easy button, but yeah, I think that's it.
There isn't in cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
I'll give Dan and Dave, if you want to jump in on that one, any misconceptions you've heard? If not, we can put it up.
Just a funny one. Sometimes people that really haven't looked at attack yet think that attack is the analysis. Like, well, let's just use attack for that. And it's, well, no, attack's just a language to kind of convey the analysis. It doesn't replace the work that you have to do. So that's kind of been a funny misconception. And so we've created almost like a vendor slick type thing on attack and what it does. And we've used that to kind of message around internally. But yeah, that's been kind of a funny one.
Nice. Very cool.
There's one misconception that I've noticed is that coming from other people in our organizations or peers is that attack is a thing instead of a way of communicating or a way of thinking. I think I've seen that.
Yeah, very similar to small view, right? Like people thinking it's a tool or something that's already done rather than a framework, a way of thinking, a way of communicating. I like that. We've got a question over here. Nice throw.
Hi, sorry, I haven't used this thing before. Sean Lingus with Cyberscoop. Dan, the financial sector's gotten quite a bit of credit for becoming more resilient in recent years in response to high-profile events, some of it nation state. Can you talk a little bit about how you've achieved that resilience and what's left to be done? I mean, you can talk about attack in that context too, but maybe specific examples from the field. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Maybe that's something we can chat through more afterwards. But I think just in concept, things like attack have really helped us be able to make the case for defenses or make the case for wanting improved resiliency, because you're able to look at trends, you're able to look at patterns, you're able to kind of aggregate data into now defined buckets instead of these kind of just general concepts. And so obviously, I think information sharing in the financial sector is fantastic. Organizations like FSARC and FSISAC are been incredibly valuable. And I think, just as we mature and we're able to continue to make the case, whether it be from observed activity at other organizations, which they've now shared to us, or by kind of diving deeper and more clearly defining what we're seeing. I think that's been a big part of it. Also, it's just because of events. It's not something that we need to kind of convince people of anymore. It's something that people are really kind of said, okay, yeah, we're fully on board. Let's fix this. Let's improve our defenses.
Great point. I think we all know cybersecurity is an issue, right? Don't have to make that case anymore. There's a new breach every day.
Yeah, and if I could just say one additional thing, in terms of like the more mature capabilities, one area that we really see a lot of investment in finance, the financial sector and other sectors from the kind of upper echelon capabilities is kind of that atomic red teaming theme where more continuously you're testing your capability to prove that you actually can do the thing that you say you can do. And I think that has been really just like the next evolution to make sure that you don't build a great capability and then have it trail off, that you're really keeping up and well, yeah, and you're staying sharp.
Dave, any comments on this one?
I'm trying to reconcile with what he was saying. I think it's really important to learn from bad things that happen wherever they happen, and to take that lessons from what people are going through now and try to do that self-examination is going to be helpful for any organization.
Thank you so much. And we've heard a lot of great things from you all. So thank you all so much. I keep going back to Dan's comment, keep it simple, right? Show the value, start with what you can, the data you have. So really appreciate all of you being here. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
And please join me in thanking Katie, our moderator. So our next presenter has a long history with cyber espionage and targeted attacks, which when I read that, I was like, what exactly does that mean? But I'll leave it to him to answer. Robert Falcone is a threat researcher with Palo Alto's Unit 42 and has spent the last 10 years focusing on malware analysis, reverse engineering, and tracking threat actors, primarily those associated with cyber espionage and targeted attacks. He's also worked as a security engineer within an operations center for a managed security service focused on intrusion detection and prevention. Please welcome Robert Falcone.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, Rich, for that introduction. I'm not going to really introduce myself because that was a pretty decent job. What I do want to say is that I'm a threat researcher. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a specific threat that we've been researching for a while now called SOPHICY. And I'm going to talk about how we're using attack when we're doing this kind of threat research. And specifically with one of the concepts we're starting to really focus our attention on, and that's adversary playbooks. Okay, so I'm going to start off talking about adversary playbooks, the concept behind it. And I'm going to start off by asking probably the most important question of this entire conference. And it's, did anyone back, late 89, 90 play Nintendo? Does anyone know what this game is? Wow, that's a pretty decent amount of folks. Okay, so for the folks that don't know what this game is, this is, what's that? Right age group. Okay, yeah, I know, right? In the right country, American football. So this is, for those that don't know, this is Tecmo Bowl. It's a football game on Nintendo, and I think there was a Super Nintendo version. But the idea was there were two players here, and one player was on offense and one player was on defense. And the offense would try to choose a play from a screen like this, and it would be like a run player, pass player, whatever. And the defense would try to pick that same play, okay? And if the defense picked the same play, they overwhelmed the offense and just dominated them, okay? Just like this. So even though this is, Bo Jackson about to get the ball, he gets crushed. He's not able to get, anywhere. And I'm using this metaphor and this analogy because that's where we want to be by using adversary playbooks. If you know what play the adversary is going to run to attack an organization, you're going to have a much better chance of defending against it. So let's, get away from Tecmo Bowl for a little bit. Let's talk about how we decided to approach this problem and to make this no longer a concept, but actually put it into reality and put it into our workflows as threat researchers. So we started off with the attack lifecycle, just because that's how, as researchers, we are focusing on how an adversary is going to carry out their attack. And it's just a phase-based approach. You may know it as the Lockheed kill chain or, whatever. But again, it's just a phase-based approach. And what we did was we wanted to use the attack framework to be able to identify the activities that an adversary is going to have to take in each one of these phases. And we wanted to be able to share this with the community, because that's a big part of Unit 42, is that we want to share the intelligence with the community for a greater good. So we ended up using STIX version 2 to be able to create objects for each one of these attack techniques and be able to apply it to the kill chain. Okay. So you guys probably recognize this. We've been talking about it for 2 days, so I'm not going to talk about it much. But I just want to take this time to thank the folks at MITRE that worked on attack and all the contributors, because this saved, without this framework, the playbook concept would never have gotten off the ground. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate that. So I mentioned that we're using STIX to be able to disseminate these playbooks and disseminate this intelligence out with the community. And I mentioned that we're specifically using version 2. And there's one main reason that we chose version 2. It's the latest and greatest, but it's also in JSON format, which is really, really helpful because we don't have to parse XML anymore. We're going to start using JSON objects to be able to identify the entities within these playbooks. And one of the other really important parts about STIX 2 is that you can relate any entities together or other JSON objects together using a relationship object. And this is actually really important because this allows us to kind of bind things together to actually be able to create these plays and playbooks. Okay, so how did we approach this? Well, like I said, we took the attack lifecycle, we took the attack framework and pre-attack, and STIX version 2, and kind of threw it in a blender just to see what we could come up with at first. And I think it actually worked because we're starting to be able to create these playbooks during our research efforts. So here's how we actually looked at the playbook concept. So at the top here, we have an adversary or intrusion set or whatever you want to call it. And underneath that, they're carrying out attack campaigns, right? And each one of those campaigns has a set number of techniques that they're going to carry out to carry out that campaign. And each one of those techniques may have a set amount of indicators that you can look for and observe to be able to see that technique happen. So in our playbook idea, we just kind of replace some of these words with these words instead. So at the top, we've got the adversary now being the playbook, because if you think about it, an adversary wouldn't have multiple playbooks. If we continue that analogy with the football team, a football team wouldn't have multiple playbooks. That doesn't really make sense. They would just have multiple pages of plays within that playbook. That's why campaigns themselves are plays. Getting back to the techniques themselves, we just mapped, like I said, we used the attack framework. We just made that mapping very easily. And indicators themselves are just STIX version 2 indicators, which are just indicator patterns that what we're able to do now is we're able to use STIX relationships to be able to bind all those together, make those relationships between STIX indicators, observables, to the actual techniques that you can identify with that indicator, and be able to relate all these things together. From there, we use another STIX object called a bundle of STIX, right? I think that was a STIX joke. But so what we were able to do with a STIX bundle is we're able to take all these JSON objects that are related to a play, a playbook, the attack techniques that were used in that play, and all the indicators, and we're able to put them in one object to be easy to be shared with the community. We can just create one object and share it out as one giant JSON object. Okay. So I mentioned that we're using STIX version 2, but we're also mapping the attack techniques to the kill chain. And I wanted to provide a quick mapping of how that works. We just did a really, very simple, very dirty kind of attack tactic to kill chain kind of mapping, and it kind of worked out, okay, for the most part. You probably can't read all of these, but some of them fall into multiple phases. Specifically, I think it's execution has some techniques that really belong in the exploitation phase. So we had to kind of make decisions on where these techniques actually fell on the kill chain. And luckily, because we use STIX 2, these are all JSON objects, we can manipulate them a little bit. Like right here, you can see we're able to assign not only the kill chain name for the attack tactic, but we can also change which phase on the Lockheed kill chain it actually belongs. And you'll see this when I show you our viewer, why this is important. Okay, so this is a playbook. Doesn't that look great, right? Humans should never read this. This is the JSON output of our playbook creator, right? But I just wanted to emphasize, this is really good if you're a machine and need to parse this really quickly, because they're all really concise JSON objects, really easy to consume from a machine standpoint. I also mentioned a human shouldn't read this. We actually created a viewer that will parse all of this for you and actually make it so your eyes don't bleed. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about a specific threat actor called Sophacy. I think someone touched on this threat group earlier in the at the conference. But I want to talk about this specific threat and use this threat as an example of how we're building these plays and playbooks for their campaigns. So let's jump off into some of the activity that we saw this threat actor carrying out in early 2018. Starting in January 2018, moving to February, another attack campaign in March 2018. Don't have time to go into all of these, but I want to focus on one that occurred, one campaign in February 2018 that we internally call Lucky Strike, okay? This was targeting government organizations in the EU and in the North America, okay? So we call it Lucky Strike internally because of the tool that they use to create the delivery document, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each one of those operational phases and what the adversary actually did in each of those phases. So then afterwards, we can actually build a play using the attack framework, okay? So let's start in the weaponization phase. Like I said, this group used this tool called Lucky Strike. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it, but it's an open source tool. It's freely available on GitHub. And what it does is it takes an Excel spreadsheet and adds a macro to it and embeds a payload to it of your choice and outputs another weaponized Excel document. Pretty straightforward, okay? So this group used that to generate their delivery document that then they deliver via spear phishing email as an attachment. And this is what the email looked like. And the interesting part about this is the delivery email itself spoofed a very well-known organization in several different industries. And the actual content of the email was written really well, really decent spearfish here. Let's move into the exploitation phase. Let's look back at that delivery email. You can actually see there's this spreadsheet attached to it, and I drew a box around this part of the email. It says, note if you're having trouble viewing the document, you can try to enable content to resolve the issue. Now, many of you may know macros are not automatically run in Microsoft Office products. You actually have to click the enable content button to run it. This is just giving you a, hey, if you can't see the contents of the document, try clicking enable content. It may fix it. Well, guess what? It does. So when you first open it, it looks like this. No content in it. But once you click the enable content button, all of a sudden you see the content. So I mean, you're seeing, the email was right. Now you click the enable content button, it resolved the issue, everything's grand, right? But unfortunately, what you did was the macro ran, and the first thing it did was it just changed the color of the text to black. Okay, so if you were just to highlight all of those cells, it would have showed up, and because you'd be able to see it, it was just in white text. Okay. However, the macro itself also installed the Trojan, and this is the code that would obtain the embedded payload from within the spreadsheet. Then the macro would take that encoded data, write it to a text file, and then use the cert util decode application, or in this case, the switch, to decode that base64 encoded data and write it to an executable, which it would later run, okay? So that's the installation process that would occur. Now, the payload that was dropped was Sophie's pretty much go-to first stage payload. Some folks call it setup loader. We call it Sophie Convert, but it's their primary go-to first stage payload. So that initial payload in the command control phase would use HTTPS to beacon its C2 server. And it looks like this. Well, technically it's in HTTPS. This is just the HTTP request that's going out. As you can see, it's just an HTTP post request to a specific domain, has some ciphertext in it, and that's the C2 channel. Let's move into the objective phase. And I will be honest, we don't have a complete view of what was going on here. We didn't see any lateral movement. Because what we found was that when we took a look at the data that was sent out in the C2, it looks like this, which is encrypted. Once you decrypt it, you can see initial local reconnaissance being done. Running processes. It's checking the hard disk and some of the NIC information, that kind of stuff. Also sending a screenshot that is meant to filter out, analysis systems and that kind of thing. Okay, but what we can surmise based off of the command handler of that payload is what they're actually trying to do. This is just, like I said, their first stage payload. All they're trying to do is to, do initial reconnaissance, find out if that's the system they want to, compromise, and then they load additional tools to be able to carry out further activities like lateral movement, privilege escalation, that kind of stuff. So now we've gone through that whole process. That was the Lucky Strike attack, looking at it from the kill chain perspective. Now I want to use that same attack and talk about how we created a play for our playbooks using that information. And I mentioned earlier when I showed that JSON that would make your eyes want to bleed. This here is the viewer that we created to parse all that JSON to make it so a human can actually click through these playbooks and understand what TTPs are being used in the lifecycle. It's you can access it right on our GitHub page. There's the link right there. So if you're interested in kind of playing around and looking at the playbooks that we have and the indicators that are associated with them, you can just go right to our GitHub. Also, the raw JSONs are also freely available on our GitHub as well, so you can do whatever you want with them. So let's go through the same lifecycle phases and kind of highlight which one of the attack TTPs that were in those phases. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's still playing bingo, but there's going to be a lot of attack techniques here, so you may win. And if you win, please shout out, because I do have a prize. So if you win, let me know. Okay, so in Recon, we have the identifier business relationships from pre-attack. And the reason why we have that there is because the actor clearly was able to identify that there was a relationship between that spoofed organization and the targeted org that would help them be successful in their attack. Moving on to the weaponization phase, we have these techniques here. And I'm just going to highlight the by domain name. In the black text here, you can see it's newly registered domain. That is our description in our play for the reason that technique is in that play. Okay, so we're able to provide a little bit more insight for the viewer why that is there. And below that, you can actually see the indicator, the STIX version 2 indicator that we created that is now is related to that attack technique right there. So if you were to see that domain cdnverify.net, you know exactly where or what adversary it's associated with, where in their operational phases it belongs, that kind of thing. Okay, moving on to the delivery phase. There's some interesting techniques here, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But here we have spear phishing messages with malicious attachments. And as you remember, the Excel spreadsheet was attached to an email sent to the target. And here you can see there's several different indicators associated with that specific technique. Moving to the exploitation phase, another interesting technique. Authorized user performs requested cyber action. This was to capture there was no software vulnerability that was exploited. So we had to use a technique from attack to specify, clicking that enable content button to infect themselves. And that's what this is used. Okay, in the installation phase, here's several different techniques that were used. And I'm just going to highlight this one real quick. The login scripts is a very specific registry key that was used by the payload to automatically run each time. And here at the bottom, I just want to kind of highlight in orange. You can see that the actual indicator pattern itself includes some logic. There's an and in there, right? So I just want to highlight the fact that STIX 2, you can actually write some pretty accurate indicator patterns by using a little bit more logic to them. Like this one requires a registry key and a specific value being used. So interesting stuff. Okay, moving into command and control, we have standard application layer protocol. One of my favorite techniques, which you'll see in a minute. Surface Burp uses HTTPS, and there's the technique that's being used. And in act on objectives phase, these are the techniques that we were able to just kind of speculate on because we didn't have a true view into what they did after they got their initial access. But this is what they did right when they got to the system. One thing I do want to highlight is the fact, usually when I get this presentation, I go through multiple of the different campaigns so you can start comparing them together. But once you do this kind of create these plays and start tracking the techniques that are used during these campaigns, you can start seeing overlaps in different campaigns by the same threat groups. So it shows that they continue to use the same techniques over and over again in their attack campaigns, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to talk about a little bit about the challenges that we came across when we were creating these playbooks. This is not a bash fest. I love attack and the framework itself and STIX. But when we first set out to make this concept into a reality, we came across some hurdles that we kind of had to overcome. First off, standard application layer protocol is a good example of where a technique is a little bit too broad. So in our plays, this doesn't really tell you what standard application layer protocol, right? It could be, in this it even says RPC, SSH, RDP, all those kind of things, right? Luckily, we were able to kind of overcome this in our plays because we're able to add descriptions, so we were relying on that. But this is an interesting one that showed that some of these are really, really broad techniques. Execution through API, very, very all-encompassing. Because this pretty much captures almost any Trojan that runs on something else using an API like create process or WinExec or load library, anything. So any Trojan that loads something else would be captured by this technique. So this would pretty much show up in almost all of our plays. Use of open source tools like the Lucky Strike attack that I just mentioned. There isn't a technique for that. And I know that the MITRE folks are really receptive to new techniques, and we've been kind of going back and forth about this one because we don't know if it's really a technique or not, but it is the flip side of using custom tooling. So there's a conversation to have there. And my favorite, and this is a lot on us because I know that several of the techniques have been deprecated. As you probably noticed in my talk, a lot of that play, some of the techniques have been deprecated. And so it's one of those things that now we have to go back through all of our plays and find the techniques that were deprecated and figure out what to replace them with in some sort of formal manner. Because quite frankly, there's not like a really one-to-one kind of, oh, replace this one with this. So we have to kind of go back and do some legwork there. Okay, moving on to STIX. I like STIX. It's fun. Just STIX2 is great because it uses JSON instead of XML. It's lots of documentation, so the information is out there. But there's like 8 or 5 different documents. They're all like 70+ pages, and there's a lot of control F going on here to be able to find anything that you're actually looking for. Okay. That being said, there are things that are sort of missing here, especially with the indicator objects. There's these things called cyber observable objects, which you use within your patterns. And in this case, there's an object for HTTP request, but there's no object for HTTP response. So you can't write any patterns for anything a C2 server would reply with because there's no object for it. Okay, STIX2 is great because it actually comes with a Python library, and which allows us to create things really quickly. And one of the things that we ran into from an issue standpoint was the pattern validator itself was pretty broken. Fortunately, the STIX folks were able to fix that with a new library. But for a while there, we weren't able to create any indicators with a double quote in it. It just would break and it wouldn't work at all. So here you can see it just had a traceback error when I tried to create that. And this is one of the patterns we try to create for this specific play, that Lucky Strike play. But we weren't able to because of this limitation. But like I said, they fixed it with their new library. Okay, I'm not going to really talk about the Attack Navigator much. I wish this tool existed when we kind of first started going down this path because there wasn't a way to really visualize and interact with the attack framework in any sort of way other than in the wiki itself. And this is actually a really cool tool that allows you to kind of interact with it. And this is that same play. All these boxes are the same play that were on the that I built in the playbook viewer, but just using the attack framework or the Attack Navigator itself. Okay, that's all I've got. I did want to kind of end and just say that as Unit 42, as we're going through our research, we're we're starting to think about attack and the attack techniques and the adversaries and how they're using these techniques to carry out these attacks. And we just wanted to be able to disseminate that kind of information to provide more context to the intel that we're gathering on a day-to-day basis for the community to absorb. And yeah, that's all I got. Here's the again, the URLs for the playbook viewer and our blog, where most of the other information that we have. Thank you. Do I have time for questions?
Yes, you do. So,
good. Any questions?
By the way, as the guy who created STIX and Taxi, I will cop to STIX 1 being something I will take to my grave. But glad to see that you've toughed it out and stuck with STIX 2.
STIX 2 is I mean, JSON's much easier to work with. And as much as I kind of gave challenges up here, it's still, well, these are, standardized frameworks. Like, it's still better than me creating our own. So, I mean, you still have to give thanks where thanks is due, right?
Yeah, no, but it's an awesome application. All right, questions for Robert? Come on, you can do it.
What would you say was like the level of effort that it took to like put together one of these playbooks, to do all the mappings? Is it like a month, a week, a day?
That's a great question. I think at first, to get this process started, I think I was given a timeline. The first one had to be done in like a month. And that was daunting at first because we didn't have any tooling to be able to create these in any sort of manner. So there was some development effort up front. So the effort level was daunting at first. But since we've actually started to do these in more repetitive function and got more familiarized with not only STIX 2, but also the attack framework, it's been easier. I will also say that the tooling we have now is much better than the stuff I wrote, because it was really poorly written. But just getting familiarized with the framework and that kind of thing was probably the biggest hurdle. I will also say there were a lot of arguments between analysts, like, oh, does this apply? Does this apply? That kind of thing between techniques themselves. But yeah, I would say at first it was a heavy lift, but then after a little bit, it got easier.
I have a two-part question. There we go. The first is, have you guys written software for the ingest of the data, so the actual data import? And the second, how much adoption have you seen from the community? Have you seen other people writing these and using these?
So ingestion, not yet. We're actually thinking about even creating tools to create them yourselves. How much adoption have we had? We have some serious interest in it. How those folks are actually using them, I'm not entirely sure. But we are having people, pulling down the JSONs and kind of getting excited about it. Else?
Could you talk just a little bit more about the process you guys are using to evaluate the malicious activity to create the playbook? And is there any automated processing that you're doing to identify the attack techniques being used?
No, not yet. I should also mention that this is we're still working on this. In fact, our tooling is not even fully there yet. We do have ideas on how we could start automating some of these things, but it's not there. Right now, it's up to the analyst as they're going through their research efforts to identify which techniques are being used and then apply that to the play. So it's largely manual right now, but we're working on it.
Any other questions for Robert?
Great. All right. I guess that's done.
Please join me in thanking Robert.
Thank you.
Okay, we know you've hung in there. We know it's been a long couple of days. We are going to take one short break, and we're going to come back to a really great presentation from the folks at Splunk, and then a okay presentation, actually just some closing thoughts from yours truly. So this is your final chance to go vote. It's your final chance to go sign the matrix. We hope you do. Track one of us down if you have any questions. We did find a phone If you would like to pick that up, go to the registration desk. Don't forget to share your experiences with us when we do the survey. And so please be back just a little before 3. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we can go to that one. All right. Sounds good. Yeah.
Let's be very clear on that. Where you find it? Just the website. I searched the site. Yeah. Just because. This is the one I read a couple weeks ago. If you lost your phone, they did report a phone was found. Okay. So I look, I was like, yeah, just in case you. Okay. Oh, it's just, I don't have to be an engineer for everything else.
All right, if you could start to take your seats, we're going to get going in just a couple of minutes.
Check one, check one, check one.
All right, so let's get going. Welcome back here in McLean and those attending the live stream. We have one final presentation, then I'll have some closing thoughts. Our last presentation, though, is on simulating the adversary to create better detections. It's from the folks at Splunk. Dave Harold is a staff security strategist for Splunk. He's currently focused on the Splunk boss of the SOC, performing research on adversary simulation for blue teams, training, and enabling technical security sales teams around the globe, and helping Splunk customers implement advanced security cases. Ryan Kovar is a principal security strategist for Splunk. Prior to that, Ryan worked at DARPA on a team dedicated to detecting and mitigating advanced threats. He moved on to Splunk as a staff security strategist, where he continues to help with IR, hunting, and solving fun problems. Please welcome Ryan Kovar and Dave Harold.
Let's click our way to success.
There we go.
All right.
Hey, everybody. I'm Dave Harold.
I'm Ryan Kovar. I'm the handsome one.
It's a picture of us from last week down at the Splunk factory floor.
It's a cruel vendor if you've never worked for them, but that's actually Splunk indexes right there.
That's right. A little disclaimer that we always have to put in, although we customized it a bit. Don't make any major life decisions based on anything we're about to show you today. No promises of fitness for purpose or just fitness in general. So let's move on here. So I'm Dave Harold. It is very good. Right. We've used it for a long time and it's very good.
Legal will find out one day.
So I'm Dave. I work at Splunk. Been there for a few years. I've been around in security for quite a while. I've done a lot of different jobs, from analyst, engineer to all the way up to CISO for payment card companies. So one of the things we do at Splunk is the boss of the SOC. We'll talk about it a lot today. We kind of use it as a vehicle for having a lot of fun, but also teaching a lot of people about security.
I'm Ryan Kovar. Like I said, I've been at Splunk for about 4 years. I get to travel all over the world, do cool things. This is my 4th conference in 4 weeks. So, and it's one of the best ones I've been to in the last 2 years. So very happy to be here.
Yeah, so before we go there, since we're the last talk of the day, we thought we'd take the opportunity to thank all the folks from MITRE and the event staff.
Especially the event staff. They're often overlooked for these things. It's fairly seamless to everyone here. But when we do these conferences, we see how well it goes and everything that happens. So truly, thank you guys for helping LDAV, making it all work. Thank you to the CFP board, the people running it, the emceeing. It's not easy to do. We've done it, and this has gone really well for a first conference.
Yeah, it's very impressive. So this is something we always put in. So Ryan and I do a lot of talks together. We do a lot of research together. One thing we try to always do is kind of bring some core value from a security perspective, not product specific, although today in particular, there's a little more product in some of the stuff that we put out there. But rest assured, the stuff that we're going to talk about and show today are things that you can do with lots of different tool sets. Okay, we're not here to pitch one tool over another.
But I do need more hoodies. They're not free. So, yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, number